Hollywood spent the early 90s finding increasingly creative ways to diminish films it didn't know what to do with, whether that meant cutting the performances that made them dangerous, mislabeling the directors who made them, or just letting them vanish before anyone could argue otherwise. These are the neo-noirs that paid the price, made by people who understood that the darkest version of a story is usually the truest one, and every single one of them paid a price the box office never captured. Samuel Jackson spent nearly 3 decades publicly furious about what happened to his performance in A Time to Kill, telling Vulture in 2023 that the scenes where Carl Lee Haley explained exactly why he killed the men who attacked his daughter were cut to make the film more comfortable for mainstream consumption. This shifted the weight away from a grieving father and onto the lead lawyer's savior arc, effectively erasing the version of the film Jackson actually made. Carl Lee is a father in Canton, Mississippi who guns down the 2 men who raped his 10-year-old daughter inside a courthouse. And Jake Brigance, a young attorney, defends him as the KKK firebombs his house and the town descends into a siege. Actual Klan members held counter-protests near the filming locations throughout the shoot, and local extras in the cross-burning scenes were filming something that for many of them wasn't history, it was memory. Director Joel Schumacher had to conduct a secret screen test to get Matthew McConaughey past studio executives demanding a proven star. And when John Grisham saw the footage, he said that's him, handing an unknown actor a $40 million film. The film grossed $152 million worldwide, and Jackson has never stopped noting that the version that made the money wasn't the version he made. Nicolas Cage bought the snakeskin jacket that defined Wild at Heart from a Los Angeles thrift store for a few dollars, became so obsessed with it that he insisted David Lynch write it into the script as Sailor Ripley's symbol of personal freedom, and gave it to Laura Dern as a wrap gift at the end of a production that had been as much a fashion statement as a survival exercise. Sailor and Lula are lovers fleeing Lula's murderous mother across a neon-soaked American South, and Lynch shoots their devotion as the only sane thing in a world determined to destroy it. At the first test screening, 80 people walked out during a graphic torture scene, and at the second, 100 more followed. Lynch cut it down, but refused to remove it, which told the Samuel Goldwyn Company everything it needed to know about what they were dealing with. Executives were so terrified that the Lynchian madness was unsellable that they essentially dumped the film into a limited release, and the industry's consensus that Lynch had finally gone too far turned the world's highest honor into a commercial liability. The film grossed $14 million against a $10 million budget. The jacket now sits in a private collection, and it remains buried by a studio that didn't know how to market a movie that was despised by the very people who awarded it, which, when you think about it, is the most Lynchian ending the whole story could have had. Director Lee Tamahori demanded his lead actors physically thicken up for Mulholland Falls, forcing Nick Nolte and Michael Madsen to gain weight and abandon their gym-toned physiques to look like the heavy-set, concrete-jawed men who actually prowled 1950s Los Angeles. Max Hoover leads the Hat Squad, LAPD detectives who throw mobsters off cliffs, and the investigation into a murder pulls them into a government conspiracy involving atomic testing in the Nevada desert. While the actors were subjected to grueling heat in heavy wool suits on the edge of actual cliffs, the performance of Melanie Griffith as Catherine Hoover became a production disaster that saw her awarded the Razzie for Worst Supporting Actress. This casting mismatch fractured the illusion of the world Tamahori was trying to build, and the fallout accelerated a decline in Griffith's status as a leading dramatic actress that sent her toward television for the following decade. MGM watched $44 million vanish when the film grossed a dismal $11.5 million and vanished from theaters in just 45 days. The Notorious B I G adopted Frank White as his primary alter ego after watching King of New York, built his entire public persona around the character's dominance, and Walken has spent decades being approached by fans who treat him with the reverence reserved for actual kingpins, none of which the $2.6 million box office gave any indication of. Frank White is a drug lord released from Sing Sing who eliminates his rivals and redirects the proceeds toward a South Bronx hospital the city has abandoned, and Ferrara shoots him as a man already haunting a city that will forget him the moment the next train arrives. The film premiered at the New York Film Festival to an audience that screamed at Ferrara during the Q&A, with Walken's wife reportedly fleeing the theater in tears, and the establishment's fury became the badge of honor Ferrara leaned into for the rest of his career. This social scandal caused the film to be treated as a scandalous exploitation piece rather than a serious drama, blacklisting it from awards consideration and mainstream prestige for years. The film's failure hid a cultural footprint that dwarfed its budget by a distance no accountant had a way to measure, and the guy who ended up defining its legacy wasn't a critic, it was Biggie Smalls. John Ridley was not invited to the set of U-Turn after Oliver Stone took his script and rewrote it into something Ridley told the Los Angeles Times he did not recognize, describing watching his work transformed with no power to stop it, as a powerlessness he later said was the best lesson he ever had in why you need to be the person holding the camera. Bobby Cooper is a small-time gambler stranded in Superior, Arizona, and Penn plays him as a man whose arrogance prevents him understanding he is not the smartest person in any room. Grace McKenna is the married local who convinces Bobby he can use her while she's already 3 moves ahead, and the tension between Penn's arrogance and Lopez's calculation is the only thing in the film that feels completely under control. The film was produced for $20 million and grossed a disastrous $6.6 million, a total wash that saw Stone receive a Razzie nomination for Worst Director. The industry viewed Stone's hyper-kinetic editing as a liability rather than an innovation, and the fallout was severe enough that studios stopped giving him a blank check for his visual instincts. Ridley won an Academy Award for 12 Years a Slave years later, but U-Turn remains a ghost in Stone's filmography, the film where Hollywood started saying no to him. David Fincher forced Michael Douglas to fall through a breakaway ceiling into a dumpster repeatedly, declined to explain why he needed so many attempts, and later admitted in the DVD commentary that making Douglas feel genuinely harassed and out of control was a deliberate tactic to ensure Nicholas Van Orton's deteriorating mental state required no performance at all. Nicholas is a cold, fabulously wealthy San Francisco banker whose birthday gift from his estranged brother, a voucher for a mysterious entertainment service, dismantles his bank accounts, his home, and his understanding of what is real. The original script ended with Nicholas murdering Christine in a paranoid rage and jumping from a building with no airbag at the bottom, a conclusion Fincher and screenwriter Andrew Kevin Walker decided was too bleak even for them, though they kept the tension high enough that audiences reported physical nausea during the final act. Fincher came in off Seven's $327 million gross, and when the $50 million game returned $109 million, the trades labeled him a niche director who couldn't handle commercial material. This verdict contributed directly to the studio interference he faced on his next project, which turned out to be Fight Club, and the executives who called Fincher a niche director were the same ones who tried to bury it. Lena Olin bruised her ribs, filming the sequence where Mona Demarkov escapes a moving car while handcuffed, refused a stunt double through the entirety of the fight scenes, and when test audiences found her too unsympathetic, the studio asked director Peter Medak to tone her down, a request Medak refused on the grounds that the violence was the point. Jack Grimaldi is a corrupt NYPD sergeant who sells witness locations to the mob and buries the cash in his backyard, whose double life collapses when he is assigned to guard Mona, a Russian hitwoman who treats his corruption with total contempt. Gary Oldman spent weeks shadowed by actual corrupt detectives, maintained Jack's paranoid energy when cameras were not rolling, and later said publicly that this was the first role where he understood his process was capable of causing genuine psychological damage. The film grossed $3.2 million against a $12 million budget, and Gramercy Pictures had no coherent way to market something too violent for romance audiences, and too strange for mob thriller audiences. The failure ended Medak's career as a feature director and sent him to television for the following decade, while Olin's performance is now cited as a direct ancestor of every unhinged female antagonist that came after, whether anyone admits it or not. Elizabeth Shue came into Palmetto as one of the most in-demand dramatic actresses in Hollywood after her Oscar nomination for Leaving Las Vegas, betting her entire professional momentum on a sweaty Florida noir that the studio didn't even know how to release. Harry Barber is a bitter former journalist who agrees to help a socialite stage a fake kidnapping to extort money from her dying millionaire husband, and the film is about a man who believes he is smarter than the situation he is walking into, which is the oldest and most reliable lie noir has ever told. The problem critics identified immediately was that Shue and co-star Gina Gershon were in the wrong roles. Gershon, who had just played the predatory femme fatale in Bound, was cast as the loyal girlfriend, while Shue was handed the seductress. And Roger Ebert put it plainly: imagine Barbara Stanwyck waiting faithfully behind the easel while Doris Day seduces the hero. Castle Rock spent $18.5 million. The film grossed $5.8 million, and the failure shifted Shue's standing from prestige lead to box office risk almost overnight. She spent the following decade in supporting roles, the kind of retreat the industry calls a pivot, but the people inside it experience as a door slammed shut on their prime. David Lynch prepared Bill Pullman for Lost Highway by leaning in before every scene and whispering that he struck him as the kind of guy who could get himself into a lot of trouble. And Pullman later told The Guardian this was the only instruction Lynch gave him across the entire shoot. Fred Madison is a saxophonist on death row for his wife's murder who undergoes an impossible transformation in his cell, becoming a young mechanic named Pete Dayton, and Lynch shoots it as a psychogenic fugue where identities dissolve and the highway loops back to the crime. Patricia Arquette plays both women Fred is destroyed by, and to prepare, she visited a dominatrix club, where customers paid to be used as furniture, studying the micro-expressions of people moving through submission and control, because Lynch had written a character who had lived all of it. The film's opening line, "Dick Laurent is dead," came from Lynch's actual life, a voice through his intercom that vanished before he found anyone outside, and French financiers demanding a clear ending were told no. Robert Blake applied his own white kabuki makeup, shaved his eyebrows, and told Lynch he hadn't understood a single word of the script, and his final film role, before his arrest for murder in 2001, made the character's habit of recording crimes and haunting a killer's conscience one of the more uncomfortable things cinema had accidentally produced. Though, accidentally is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Dennis Hopper and Don Johnson entered a professional death spiral on the set of The Hot Spot that effectively ended both of their streaks as Hollywood heavyweights. Johnson arrived on the dusty Texas set via private helicopter with a full entourage and a personal cook, a display of glamour that Hopper found so repulsive it triggered a Cold War where the director and lead actor completely stopped speaking. Johnson plays Harry Maddox, a drifter who maneuvers into a car dealership job and gets caught between the boss's predatory wife and a bookkeeper with a dark secret. But the real drama was the absolute silence between takes that turned the set into a vacuum. The most calculated risk came from 19-year-old Jennifer Connelly, who used the film's graphic nature to violently dismantle her child star image, a move she viewed as a mechanical necessity to be taken seriously. When the film bombed, Hopper publicly blamed Johnson and Madsen for refusing to promote it. Johnson's official excuse was that he was too busy shooting Harley Davidson and the Marlboro Man to do a single interview, which is exactly the kind of alibi that ends working relationships permanently. The studio watched $15 million vanish into a pitiful $1.2 million return, a failure so loud it essentially ended Hopper's run as a reliable studio hand. It's the ultimate proof that in a town this small and this hot, if the people making the movie don't believe in the story, the audience won't either. If you've ever felt like the best version of something got taken away before anyone could argue for it, you already understand every film on this list. The box office never captured what they cost the people who made them, but the films outlasted every decision that tried to bury them.